Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about how you know what piece of gear to use. So I'm Daniel Norton, photographer here in New York. I make videos like this. This is going to be about gear, I guess, and also a little bit about philosophy, business, things like that. If you're interested in those kind of things, go ahead and subscribe. So this is kind of an answer to a lot of different, but kind of with the same, I think, base questions that I got on the video I did last week, where I made a statement that I don't pick up a piece of equipment and then think of what to shoot. I think of what to shoot and then go get the right gear for it. And a lot of people ask, in various different ways, well, how do you know what a piece of gear does if you don't use it or try it or whatever? And that comes down to a few things. So number one, clearly experience will teach you. I mean, that's the obvious answer, right? Like, how do I know what a softbox does? Well, I've used a softbox much times, so I know what it does. But what if you're faced with a piece of gear that you've never used before? Or you're trying to produce a kind of light that you've never produced and you're looking for gear that might do that. How do we know? And this goes for I might touch on camera related stuff too, but for the most part I'm going to do lighting. I think lighting is more tricky for people than cameras. I don't know, I feel like people are more willing to just grab any lens or whatever and shoot a bunch of stuff to learn what it does, but when it comes to lighting, they're kind of like, don't know if I should touch this. So let's talk some basics, right? And I think that's really what it comes down to, fundamentals and basics. So we know, right, by using light or some of the ideas of light, that there's kind of this like axis of hard, soft, right, and diffuse and specular, right? We've got these different characteristics of light that are our main things we're thinking of. There's also color and stuff like that, but for the most part, coverage, stuff like that. And one of the first things you're going to want to do when you're looking at a piece of equipment is you can actually probably tell by looking at it in almost all cases where it falls in that graph, right? We know that a hard light is small relative to its subject and a soft light is big relative to its subject, right? We know that a specular light is going to be more kind of focused, whereas a diffuse light is going to be more diffused, right? So we know that things like silver or any kind of metallic reflectiveness is going to amplify the specularity of our light. Oftentimes lenses will do that too, though not always, because the lens might be diffused, right? Anything that spreads our light out or scatters our light is going to diffuse it, right? So, bouncing it off of a wall will diffuse the light, shooting it through diffusion, because when the light hits the diffusion, it scatters, right? Anything that brings our light in tighter would make it more specular. That's essentially how that works. Most of the time, getting things more specular is not people's challenge, because a lot of things are specular by nature. So what we look at, again, using nature as the example like I always do, the sun, right, because of where we are, is very small to us. So even though the sun is huge, it is small to us. So the sun is a hard light source. The sun is also a specular because it's very direct, right? It's coming right at us. These rays are hitting us. They're scattered somewhat by the blue sky, but not that much. But now you put some clouds in between you. And by putting the clouds there, you now change two things. The clouds become your light source. So even though clouds might be, a mile in the sky, right? They're still way closer than the sun was, which means they're much larger, which means the light's going to be softer, right? Your shadow edges are going to go soft. It's also less specular because when the light hits the cloud, it scatters even more, right? It's diffusing the light. The light's spreading out everywhere. That's diffused, right? So this is kind of what we want to look at when we're thinking about an object, right? If somebody hands me let's say a beauty dish, right? If somebody gives me a beauty dish is about 22 inches, right? Let's say this beauty dish is silver on the inside. So I know that because it's silver on the inside, it's going to be specular, right? I know that if they also hand me the diffusion silk that you can put on the outside of it, that will help with that, right? It'll reduce the specularity because put in the diffusion in front is going to make it diffused, right? In addition to that, it's hard or soft. What am I using it for, right? If I'm going to use it on, let's say, a portrait of somebody and I'm going to back it up a bit, it's not going to be super large, right? So it's going to be a bit of a punchier, harder light. Now, I can take a beauty dish and put it super, super close. Let's say, for instance, I was just going to do a shot of somebody's fingernails, right? And basically, I could bring the dish super close because it's not going to, it's not going to get in my shot because I'm only focused here, right? So if I do that, the light then can become very big, right? And I could use it either more specular as it is, or I could put the diffusion on it, which will spread the light out. I'll also take this moment to insert this little tidbit here, which I think is, I don't know, I see people do this all the time, so it's kind of like, if you are using a beauty dish, or really anything, and you put a grid on it, right? So a grid is going to reduce the spread of the light, right? The grid is which we're going to talk about in a second more, but it's going to reduce the spread of light. If you then put diffusion on the outside of that, which I see people do a lot with beauty dishes, they put that silk over the outside, you basically kill most of what you're trying to do with the grid, because when it hits the silk, it's going to spread out again, because diffusion spreads out your light. That's something we have to keep in mind, right? We might want a very diffuse light, but it's going to spread out dramatically when we diffuse it versus if we don't. So, you know, if that's the case, then we're going to want to employ things like barn doors, or, you know, flags in order to keep the spread where we want it. So that's something to keep in mind, spread, which I'm going to go right back to in a second. So, by the same token, we're talking about the silver beauty dish. If somebody gives me a 3 foot by 4 foot softbox, right? It's got multiple layers of diffusion. It might be silver inside. It might be white. It's you know, you're going to put the multiple layers, like I said, of diffusion on it. It's large. Let's say for that same thing, that same, you know, head and shoulder portrait, it's even larger, right? So we know it's going to be soft because it's very large, right? We know it's going to be diffused because it has 2 layers of diffusion. It's really scattering the light everywhere, right? So we know. I've never used that 3 foot by 4 foot softbox. I've never used that silver beauty dish, but I know what they do because I can look at them and say, well, this is what light does. Because light is, and we made another video about this, light is predictable, right, on some level, right? You can kind of know what it's going to do on some level, right? If I have a window and I'm standing in my studio, which is a daylight studio, and the sun's coming through the windows, we know the light's going to be hard, right? If somebody stands in that sunlight, they're going to have harsh shadows on their face. If I pull the shades, all of a sudden the light's soft. How do I know that's going to happen? Because they're blind, like silk blinds. When I pull the silk blind, that becomes my light source. It goes from being far away and specular to very close and diffused. So we can use this example for almost any piece of lighting gear that we look at. We can predict what it's going to do by looking at it. You know, by the same token that I can say a 2 foot by 3 foot, let's say softbox, standard softbox, is soft-ish, you know, for a, you know, head and shoulders portrait, I can say it's hard for a full body shot, you know, or relatively hard, you know. It's all relative, right? It's a sliding scale. So that's how we know. The other thing that you want to think about is the spread of the light. So this is another thing when it comes into fact. Look, when you're bringing a light into a space and you're lighting something up, you've got to know, like, what part of how you're going to know how it's going to look is by how much it spreads. Because, for instance, I am, again, lighting, you know, a face, and I'm using something, let's say, that has a grid on it, or maybe it's a hard light that can be focused. That is going to change how much coverage I have on my subject. So let's say I have a softbox that's small like this, right? I can move it in close like this with no grid. It's going to, you know, it's going to cover maybe a waist up, right? Because it's got a maybe 120 degree spread. If I put a grid on it that reduces the spread to 40 degrees, it might only light the head and shoulders and drop off dark on the body. So this is something I know, right? The spread of the light is going to determine where it covers. It's also going to determine how much a reflector will do. It will also determine how much it'll make an effect, let's say, on our background, because all of that factors into how much the light spreads. And most manufacturers, on some place, if you look hard enough, will have a listing of the spread of the different lights, especially with hard reflectors, with grids, things like that that are designed to control the light. Softboxes, just a general thing, are usually around 120 degrees. This is not always 100% true, but if you're guessing, you know, so they're spreading out about 120 degrees roughly. So you can think about that like that. So relatively speaking, with all that in mind, you can, right, and we can all look at a piece of gear, right, and determine what it's going to do before we've even used it before. And by that same token, we can imagine a photo. We can say, okay, I want this shot to be a portrait, and I want their face to be very softly lit, but I want them to be fall off on the body so it goes dark. You know, I want the no light to hit the background. Well, I know now I'm going to want a relatively large light source or one that's smaller and brought in close with something to modify where the light falls. Either I'm backing it up and using flags or possibly a grid, or I'm moving in real close, right? And then that's going to reduce where it spreads. all that kind of works the same, right? I could use two different tools to do a very similar thing. Will it be exactly the same? I mean, probably not exactly, but it'll be close. And that's how we know. So I'm curious, like, how do you guys generally learn with gear? Do you watch like a lot of videos, look at a lot of photos of things, and then go, I think I could do that shot with this piece of gear? Or do you just buy stuff based on what you think, you know, that you know, which is what I just explained, what you do know, I shouldn't say you think you know, what you know about lighting, that so you can imagine what something's going to do. Like, how do you guys approach it? Because I'm curious about that. I think that using the second approach, like understanding lighting, it helps you try more stuff, right? Because I think that, you know, lighting modifiers are kind of expensive, and if you're not in the spot where you can rent easily, it's probably a hesitation to buy something because you're not sure, do I need that? You know, do I need a snoot? Do I need barn doors? Do I need diffusion? Do I need a beauty dish? Do you? You know, it's hard to know unless you know what it does. But at least thinking of the basic qualities of light, you can understand, at least in theory, what each piece of gear will do and what they'll add to your repertoire. Like, I'll give a quick story before I end, because I always like to give quick stories. I had this friend of mine, I was advising him on lighting, and he was looking at this, like, these Mola beauty dishes, and he was like, wow, Mola makes a huge one. I figured out how big it is. It's like 5 feet. It's like gigantic. It's really expensive. He's like, that would probably be awesome. I love the look of a beauty dish, and that'll be like extra soft. And I even said to him, I'm like, right, but by making it so large, it's not going to really look like a beauty dish anymore. You're just going to be able to move it in close because of the deflector. And he was like, yeah, but I think, and he bought it, and sure enough, it was exactly that. To him, I mean, it did look different, but to him, it didn't look that much different than a softbox that was double diffused. Because basically, yeah, I mean, it's even and really big and really diffused. Because remember, a beauty dish is reflected light, right? It's bouncing around the sides. So yes, it does look different, but it wasn't different enough for him to justify the $500, $600. So he kind of felt like, wow, I bought that, and I mean, he still used it, but he was kind of like, I could have just used my softbox, for a similar effect. So always think about that kind of stuff. I mean, there are advantages that I don't want to bust on the giant Mola dishes. They're awesome, actually. If you get a chance to rent one, I recommend them highly, especially with a grid. Really tight control. That's another video, maybe. But anyways, my point being is that you should be able to analyze stuff even if you've never used it. I'd never used that Mola before, but I knew that the same way I know that like a brown color power is more punchy and more specular because you can focus it, right? Because the focusing makes things more specular without me actually using it, even though they're soft. I mean, I have used them now, but before I had ever used one before. Anyways, let me know, guys. If you have more questions, of course, put them in the comments below so we can keep going with this. Again, I'm trying to get back on a roll here. I got some time now, so I'm trying to get more videos out answering you guys' questions. If you have not subscribed, go ahead and do that. Ring the bell so you get the notifications, and I'll see you next time.